And there is one concept that encompasses both of these steps, the inward examination and the petitioning, and it is the driving force behind all prayer, and that's called kavanat halev, which is the devotion from the heart. And this goes back to the root of halal, which is the inner introspection. And that comes from kavanah. You'll hear this word in Hebrew conversations constantly as far as prayer is concerned. Kavanah is the innermost single-mindedness, intentional concentration of the heart. Without kavanah, it is taught in Judaism that your prayers are rendered void, that your words have no emphasis behind them and they will not be heard. Kavanah is the intent of the heart. And without that proper heart intent, our petitions hit a ceiling. They are blocked, in essence. We must first see if there are any anxious or wicked things within us before our petitions can be heard. Again, this is the concept, kavanah, of the heart that encompasses both the inward examination and the process of petitioning after that. The Talmud hints at this when it states that prayer is a service of the heart, not of the mouth. This is what the rabbis teach. This kavanah has always been considered essential to true prayer. One rabbi wrote that prayer without kavanah, without a pure heart intent, is like a body without a soul. This implied that words spoken without the proper heart intent are rendered lifeless. Another rabbi famously stated that one who makes one's prayers fixed, that person's prayers are not sincere petitions. Now think about that for a moment, because these are established prayers that I'm discussing here. But the rabbis have taught that just because they are established in time and that we recite them on a daily basis doesn't mean that in the spirit they should be fixed. You see what I'm saying? In the spirit, you are uttering words that are essentially fully biblical. And just because you are uttering the same things on a regular basis doesn't mean that they are devoid of spirit. Because if you have the right heart intent, there is soul behind them. There is life behind them. So they're only fixed or established if your heart condition is lacking. Now, if your heart is in the proper place, they rise up as incense before the throne of God, and they are heard each and every time. Just like the prayers of the disciples, the Jewish disciples in Acts, the early part of Acts, and Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, when it says, your prayers have been heard. They have been heard because they came from a proper place. So now let's look a little bit closer in Scripture at prayer. These tefillot that we recite, what they're based on. Originally, the Jewish people worshipped Adonai with offerings, with sacrifices. If you remember in the wilderness, these korbanot, the plural for the Hebrew of offerings, korban means to be drawn near. Sacrifices is a very, it is an incorrect translation, the word sacrifice. In my opinion, you should always use the word offering, because offering means to be drawn near, to offer something. The Hebrew word for offering, which is often translated as sacrifices, means to be drawn near. Via this action, the people were being drawn near to him. When the temple was destroyed and the people were sent into exile in 586, prayers with words took over for the offerings. They became a substitute. The offerings of fire were replaced by the offerings of the lips. These prayers were strategically placed to coincide directly with the times of the daily sacrifices, the time of the daily tamid. Tamid, again, eternal, perpetual. Let's look at the times of these offerings here. Numbers 28, 3 through 4. You shall say to them, this is the offering by fire, which you shall offer to the Lord. 2 male lambs, 1 year old, without defect, as a perpetual burnt offering every day. You shall offer the one lamb in the morning, and the other lamb shall offer in the afternoon. Now, why did I bold morning and afternoon? Because these two became the foundation for what we know today as the Hebrew prayers. Because when this went away, prayers were established for morning and prayers were established for afternoon. The morning prayer, to replace the 1-year-old lamb offering of the Tamid sacrifice, became known as Shakar, which means dawn, early morning. This eventually became the Shacharit prayer service, which is essentially what we did today. When you are worshiping in a Hebrew fashion, when you are uttering Hebrew prayers in the mornings, this is part of a Shacharit prayer service. This replaced the morning Tamid sacrifice. Coinciding with the afternoon offering of the 1-year-old lamb, became known as Mincha. Mincha means gift or offering. And this became part of the traditional Mincha service. It is during this service that Yochanan and Shimon, Simon Peter, went to the temple, the afternoon prayers at 3 o'clock. And it was during this time of prayer that Cornelius was visited by his angel. The time of the afternoon lamb offering, perpetually given. And in the midst of the exile of Babylon, a third time was added, known as Ma'ariv, which comes from the Hebrew word erev, which is evening. And this format was based on this psalm right here, Psalm 55:17. Evening, morning, and afternoon, I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice. Interesting context, isn't it? You can imagine this prayer being uttered by many, many thousands of native Israelites as they are being taken to Babylon, leaving their homeland. The Hebrew day always starts in the evening, hence the use of the word evening first. Evening, morning, and afternoon, because the day begins at sundown. And the format for the 3 services began based upon this psalm here. And you can begin to see this reality even in the scripture in Daniel 6:10. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open towards Jerusalem. Again, another custom of praying towards Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. I don't believe that this is a coincidence. I can't sit here and tell you that this is absolutely connected, but in my opinion, given the timing, the diaspora, and everything that was taking place at the time, it's safe to say that these times were replacing the times of the sacrifices in the midst of the diaspora in Babylon. As the years of the exiles went by, the developing traditions continued. The people eventually came back to the land and were faced with a very unique dilemma. What do we do with these traditions that we have now established in the midst of endeavoring to build a new temple? Because if you remember, these prayer services, these prayers, were replacing the times of the offerings, right? So here they are, under the guidance of Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, Zerubbabel, and they come back, and their desire is to rebuild the temple. Well, what do we do with these prayers? Do we now negate them, since we are about to begin offering the sacrifices again and receiving the offerings? 5th century BCE, they decided, you know what? That there's much value in this that was developed in the Babylonian experience. So the prayer stayed. And a body of men was formed called the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, which was known historically as the Men of the Great Assembly. 5th century BCE, comprised of 120 prophets, scribes, and sages, headed up by Ezra. Now again, this is post-exile. 12 years later, Ezra was joined by Nehemiah, and it is taught that they received the Torah from the three post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi.